fighter has the highest fight IQ?
I don't think there's nobody in the game that has the fight IQ that I have.
Off the charts.
His IQ
the
is
highest
insane.
fight IQ maybe ever.
This guy hits hard. He's tough. He's this, he's that. And this guy has a dream. But my fight IQ will win this fight.
Welcome back to the Fight IQ podcast. We're here with another episode, just some breaking news, some matchups that got announced. There also is a card this weekend. I don't know if you guys realized, but there is a card this weekend. We're not going to be going through the whole card, but we're each going to pick one fight that doesn't completely suck to kind of talk about. As you can see on the screen here, Edwards versus Madalena got announced. We also have UFC Fight Night Cejudo versus Song Yadong. I think that's probably going to end up being the main event, but that's going to be February 22nd in Seattle. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that card. But I kind of want to get started here with the Edwards versus Madalena matchup. I personally like this matchup. JDM clearly, deserves a guy at the very top. If he wasn't going to get a number one contender fight with Shavkat Rakhmonov, this is probably the next best fight for him. What were your initial thoughts on this matchup?
Yeah, I kind of saw this one come out of nowhere a little bit with the fact that there was so much talk around JDM fighting Usman. And then that kind of seemed to be one of those things, like right up until the point where it was like, there's no other thing to do besides confirm it. They're like, nope, Usman's not fighting. It's not going to be in Australia. And then we have to wait a little bit longer to get anything to hear about JDM. So I like that we're finally getting some news for him for sure. And Leon's obviously in that top, 3 title contention kind of place. So it's one of those folks where it does put JDM in a good spot where if he wasn't going to fight Shavkat, it's the next best thing.
Yeah, I think it's a really good fight for JDM too, because Leon Edwards is primarily a striker, and he does have some takedowns and stuff like that, but I feel like JDM's grappling is good enough to kind of nullify that at this point. He really held his own with one arm against Gilbert Burns, and even in a fight where he's down multiple rounds, he's still, good enough to find the finish just by being gritty and being down to scrap in there. And I think that's a very big difference between where Leon's at in his career and where JDM is at. Like, there's a lot of points where Leon, if he just had a little bit more aggression, probably could have caused more damage to Bilal in their fight, but he just didn't have it in him. And like when JDM was put in that exact same situation against Gilbert Burns, he was able to find the finish there, which is very impressive.
Yeah, I don't think there's really much of a question of who has more grit when it comes to fighting. Obviously, we know that Edwards can deal with adversity and come back from adversity. We've seen that, particularly in the first fight against Usman. He can get stuff done even when things are not going his way. This, to me, is one of those where it's going to be really, really hard for me to pick in the predictions video. I think this is a tough fight for both guys personally. I think Edwards, in the kickboxing realm, is a little more technically savvy. Madalena's boxing, obviously that's what he's known for. His boxing is strong, but he needs to get to that boxing range to be able to put hands on Leon. And Leon is really good at keeping the fight at his range. I think, obviously we'll go more into this matchup and break it down a little further as we move closer and we're kind of breaking down the card and the main fights on this card. But off of gut, I do think Edwards is going to win this fight.
I don't know that I agree. Just from the standpoint of I do think that Edwards being a more technical kickboxer is important. Obviously, that head kick is a big weapon of his, and even if he starts throwing it and trying to hit the arms with it, it's one of those things where, let's see if Madalena is really healed up fully, if he's willing to kind of commit to blocking with that arm. But at the same time, I do think that Madalena has a decent kickboxing arsenal himself. We've seen him mix it up. He likes to kind of throw different ranges and things like that. But if it ends up being like a long kicking range kickboxing fight, I do think Leon could edge him out for sure.
Yeah.
I think the pressure of JDM is going to be too much for Leon at this point. One of the things that you see across all of Leon's fights is that he needs things to be very pretty, like very similar to like Adesanya. He's not one of those people that can really throw in like the pocket or anything because he likes being at that kickboxing range where he can have multiple exits and stuff like that. And it's almost to a fault. Sometimes he wants things to be so perfect that he's just not going to throw anything. And he even does that in the Nate Diaz fight. I just be like, JDM is going to be able to close the distance or at least pressure him against the fence and be able to find a lot of success there. But we won't know until they fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll probably change my mind like 2 or 3 more times as we're like moving closer to this fight actually happening. Another fight that we're going to talk about briefly that just got put on this card as well, Michael Chandler versus Paddy Pimblett.
It's time.
I think this is a great matchup personally. I think they're kind of, one's coming down, one's coming up. They're meeting in the middle. I didn't really know if Chandler was going to have another fight, I didn't really know who they were going to put him up against. And Paddy Pimblett obviously needed a guy who's higher up in the rankings. I honestly think this is great matchmaking on the UFC's part.
Yeah, this is a big one. I know there was obviously a lot of talk about Paddy Moicano. They both kind of wanted that fight, but obviously Moicano got booked. It kind of left Paddy in a weird place where we weren't really sure what they were going to do with him. So I think the fact that they went with Chandler is kind of interesting. It gives him somebody that's been in the top part of that division, somebody that's been a title contender before. So I think it's going to be an interesting way to see if Paddy can kind of back it up on that level. I mean, so far we've seen, some great performances, some maybe not so awesome performances, but for the most part, I think this is kind of a good test to really see if Paddy is what he says he is.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think where Michael Chandler's at in his career, this is a very winnable fight for Paddy. I feel like this is a pretty dangerous fight for Michael Chandler to be taking because after, if you lose to Paddy Pimblett, you're going to really have to start giving like these other guys a chance at, fighting Michael Chandler because he's only been in these really big fights this whole time he's been in the UFC. So I'm surprised he got like still a pretty highly like entertaining fight, honestly, with how many losses he has. But yeah, man, it's going to be sick. I like the matchup quite a bit.
Yeah, and the more I think about it too, it's kind of like one of the only things you really could do with Chandler because of the way that he came onto the scene, like the UFC scene, and since then has really only been fighting the top guys. It would be kind of weird to give him someone lower than Paddy Pimblett in the rankings. Mm-hmm. Paddy Pimblett has that name, so it's like Michael Chandler deserves big fights, whether that's someone at the top of the division to be a title contender or whether that's just someone like Paddy with a big name. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be a fun fight. Personally, I'm leaning Chandler here. I'm probably going to change my mind a few times again as we're moving forward to this. But I am kind of leaning Chandler here.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking the other way. My brain wants to go Paddy by triangle, right? But, we've seen Michael Chandler end up in some pretty dangerous grappling situations. Obviously, Oliveira is a very, very high-level grappler, but has put Chandler in some really dangerous situations off of his back. Paddy's got a very high-level grappling game as well. I'd love to see if he can maybe exploit some of those same kind of avenues that we've seen him have success or seen Chandler struggle with. So I think there's a really cool potential here. If it stays on the feet, I think Chandler's obviously got a bit of an advantage. He's very explosive. He's very strong, very athletic. Doesn't necessarily, I think, use his wrestling in the way that we could see him use it. And I don't know if that's going to be a game plan change for him for this one or not.
I mean, it would be like a Michael Chandler IQ level thing to choose this fight to use his grappling in. He's had historically has had pretty terrible decisions when it comes to decisions he's making inside the octagon. But I think Michael Chandler is probably going to lose this one. I just think, he's getting up there, and I feel like we're counting on like the one shot or like maybe like a couple big shots that he's going to have to land to Paddy Pimblett. But ultimately, it's going to be an interesting matchup because I feel like they're both very momentum heavy fighters where they always have to be in control of the fight moving forward for them to have success. And we'll see who is able to, get that game plan off.
Yeah, I know we were talking about it a little bit before and we were talking about the Bobby King fight, and it's Paddy seems to do well in those moments of like really high levels of chaos. It seems like that's kind of when he's able to find some openings. And Chandler is obviously one of those guys that just tries to make the entire fight that moment of chaos. So it may be an opportunity for Paddy to really kind of take advantage.
Yeah, regardless, I do see this being a very fun fight. On paper, it sounds fun. When I think about all the different ways it could go, I don't see how this one isn't a fun fight in the end.
Yeah, great card.
Yeah.
Great fight to add to the card for sure.
Absolutely. Moving on to some other fights that got announced. We have UFC Seattle. Now, it looks like Cejudo versus Song Yadong is going to be the main event, which I'm not really mad at. And then on the undercard, we have Rob Font versus Dominic Cruz. It's no secret. I think the UFC matchmaking lately has been absolutely horrible. I don't know what they're doing, honestly. There are even times where it's like, oh, clearly you make this fight next. They just go and make something completely random. I think all the fans wanted to see Dominic Cruz versus Jose Aldo. And I think there's a bunch of other matchups you could have made for Rob Font. Just to go even further on this bad matchups, Curtis Blades versus Rizvan Kuniev. Like, I know that matchup got made weeks ago and people have already talked about it, but, like, what the fuck are we doing? Edson Barboza getting Steve Garcia, whatever. They're giving Steve Garcia a chance at the top 15. John Silva versus Melsik Bagdasaryan. Great fight.
Love that one.
Yeah, we love that one. Ibo Aslan versus Iwan Kutalaba. I'm pretty sure I called that one in a next matchups video. And then probably the last one that we want to look out for on this card is Brendan Allen versus Fluffy Hernandez. That, yes, I think is actually in the top 15 of the middleweight bout outside of who we're talking about fighting for the title. I think that's one of the best matchups in the top 15 you could make.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I would love to see Anthony Hernandez finally be able to kind of break into that upper half. He's been on such a great streak recently, and he's been looking really good in his last couple fights. And Brendan Allen's one of those guys where, if I remember correctly, his last fight was not that impressive.
No,
it was
I think
kind
he
of
lost
clinging
to
on to a
Imavov.
win or a loss there.
Yeah, and it was an IQ thing. He was winning on the feet, and then he would keep shooting for takedowns that were getting defended very easily. Mm-hmm. But whenever he would strike, he would have so much success, and he would rock him and then like try and shoot in on his hips in round 5 after getting beat up the whole fight. It's like it was an IQ thing for sure.
Yeah.
Which maybe hopefully he can work on that, right? But Anthony Hernandez as of late has been looking really good, especially on the feet. And if Brendan Allen hasn't learned anything, I think that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, personally, like my first thoughts about this matchup, I think it's good stylistically. You got two of the best grapplers in the division. Personally, I just think Fluffy is a little bit better at getting his game plan to work. And when you're talking about two guys who have a similar skill set, and I think, in my opinion, Fluffy is just better at it, I see Fluffy coming out on top here.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Henry Cejudo versus Song Yadong a little bit.
Yeah, that kind of feels like it came out of left field a little bit. I mean, I know Cejudo has talked about coming back. He's kind of been wishy-washy. Maybe I'll retire. Maybe I'll come back just to win the belt again. But if he's doing that, fighting Song Yadong is an interesting choice. I mean, I don't necessarily think that Cejudo benefits massively from a win over Song Yadong. But in verse, Song Yadong does benefit greatly if he's able to beat Cejudo.
I think it's like a really big test to prove even to Cejudo if he's still got it. Song Yadong is a very good fighter and he's in the top 10, but he's not the elite of the division. No. He's not in that top 5, and I think Cejudo probably sees this as more of like all right, let me get in there, get a nice good win, and see how I'm gonna stack up against these guys and see from there if he wants to make a run or not.
Yes, Cejudo
flirting around going back down to 125, which I think would be a much better choice for him. But if he's going to stick around at bantamweight, like there's a lot of killers up at the top 5,
Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing because, Henry Cejudo is like definitely one of the best flyweights that we've ever seen. And then he moved up to bantamweight because he wanted to become double champ. He did it. But I think he maybe got a little like disillusioned that, oh, now I'm a bantamweight sort of thing, when it's like, man, I don't know, I think you're just a flyweight who was able to move up and get that belt. But having a sustained career at bantamweight is much different than just moving up for one fight to get your double champ status. I do personally think that this fight makes a lot of sense. They're number 7 and number 8. And Henry is a smart competitor. He's been competing in martial arts his entire life. He knows that he needs to pick up a win. He's not like one of these guys that's just like, oh, I'm going to sit on the sidelines for the perfect fight. He knows, he understands competition, and he knows that if he wants to get back into the title picture, he needs to beat a guy like Song Yadong, and I think he will. I think his wrestling is better. I think he's got underrated striking as well. I think his striking is very good. The way he was able to adjust and come back in the Marlon Moraes fight was crazy. The way he was able to dominate Dominic Cruz on the feet. I think he's a very underrated striker, and I do see him getting it done in this matchup, personally.
Yep, me too.
Let's talk about Rob Font versus Dominic Cruz. Speaking of Dominic Cruz.
It's going to be a lame fight.
Yeah, super.
I guess.
It's just a tough skill, for sure. But, I mean, it's a really interesting matchup because Rob Font does have a really nice jab. We're going to see how elusive Dominic Cruz is because he is getting really old. He's been doing this for a long time. Has a lot of injuries. We'll see if he's still able to be slick because it seems like lately he's been getting figured out. People know now. It's like, what his tendencies are in that funky movement that they weren't able to make adjustments for when he was in his prime. And now they're timing head kicks on him and, big attacks like that. And when you have a style that's really built on momentum, when you're running into things, it just makes it so much worse. So it'll be interesting to see if Rob Font has the weapons to capitalize on that stuff or if Dominic Cruz still has it. But I think he even said this is probably going to be his last fight too, which is crazy.
Yeah, kind of a weird fight to go out on. You'd think like a guy like Dominic Cruz, who people talk about him being one of the best bantamweights of all time. You're like, really, Rob Font is going to be your retirement fight? A fight that you're probably going to lose? I think it's a bad matchup for Cruz, personally. I mean, Rob Font is really, really good at landing his jab and finding combos off of that. He has really, really nice body shots. It would serve him well to implement some leg kicks, which we haven't really seen a ton from Rob Font because he is very boxing focused. But personally, I think this is a bad matchup for Cruz. Font lands a lot on people. Even in the fight that he lost against Cheeto, he outstruck him by like 1.5 times or something. And Dominic Cruz doesn't have the chin that Cheeto has. I think if Rob Font can start putting combinations on Cruz, Cruz is going to wear the damage. It's not going to go very well.
No, and I mean, especially if we start talking about, the injuries that Cruz has had. I know there's been multiple rib injuries that have been debilitating and have taken him out of fights at points. And if you do have Rob Font, who is a guy that likes to go to the well and throw those body shots, how can Cruz hold up with that? How are the injuries holding up with that as he aged? That, and I do think that people have figured him out, right? I think a lot more people are kind of able to emulate his style, and it's not such an unorthodox thing that you wouldn't see anymore like it was when he was in his prime.
Right. In the WEC days, it was like, holy shit, this dude's movement is crazy. And nowadays,
and that was crazy when people were switching stances. That was at a point where stance switching was not a common practice, whereas nowadays, if you can't switch stances, you're probably at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to actually pick Dominic Cruz in this fight. I do still rate his defense highly. He's not a Cheeto Vera that just puts his hands up and walks you down. He's still very in and out, still has, very good side-to-side movement. And I haven't really seen Rob Font implement a good enough kicking game to be able to time some stuff like that I'm seeing. But I feel like it's going to be tough for him to land his jab on a really moving target and build those combinations. I could be completely wrong because, Dominic Cruz is getting up there, but I still want to believe. So I'll take Dominic Cruz.
All right. Want to talk about John Silva versus Melisik Bagdasaryan? I mean, personally, John Silva is my favorite fighting nerd.
Nice.
I think his vibe inside the octagon is he's the most present, All the other fighting nerds are like very technically focused. I mean, you could say even like Carlos Prates, like the fight where he was fighting. Oh man, I'm blanking on his name now, but where the Justin Gaethje copycat, whatever his face is, where he grabs his wrist, hits him with a shot, and holds onto his wrist.
I think it was Rebecca, wasn't it? No.
No.
He just had a good win.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. He held the wrist and he just popped him. Ah.
Yeah, and then the fade back held onto the wrist and KO'd him with the knee to the liver. Absolutely crazy. That was pretty cool. But John Silva is just a different beast in there. He's like not just fighting and paying attention technicality wise, but he's legit having fun in there.
Yes,
and
that's a big difference.
Yeah, I love fighters that just have fun in there. And as a featherweight, going up to lightweight and doing what he did to Drew Dober is absolutely crazy to me.
Nuts. It was Charles Radke, by the way.
Charles Radke. Yeah,
he just had a really good win.
Yeah.
Himself, so.
Yeah. Very impressive. I mean, John Silva, he not only has power, but his distance management is really good too. It's very rare that you see shorter guys like this who are known for like having powerful strikes where you're like, oh, they're also very good at keeping distance.
Yeah. One of the like things that stands out a lot to me from John Silva, him and Rufy have this same skill, I should say, is they're intercepting counters. He was hitting Drew Dober with like intercepting elbows. Like when he would throw a cross, John Silva would lean off the center line and the cross would go over his shoulder and he would land the elbow. And you're literally running into a brick wall. And Rufy has the same style of counters where it's like both of you guys are going to throw at the same time and he knows he's going to land and he knows you're going to miss. So it's going to be an interesting matchup to see if he's able to land some really cool stuff on Bagdasarian.
Yeah, and it's not just the slipping elbows like we saw in the Drew Dober fight. He was also slipping and spinning. He landed this really, really nice spinning elbow on Dober that actually was, I think that was what led to the finish.
Yeah.
But he slipped off the center line, anticipating that straight right hand, and actually spun and countered with a spinning elbow. Like to be able to manage distance like that, know the shot's coming, and do it with counter with difficult techniques like elbows, it's just a different level that we're seeing from him. And Melsik Bagdasarian is a good striker, but he's kind of predictable, which when you're talking about being able to predict counters to the ability of John Silva, I think it's a very winnable fight for John Silva here, and I think he'll land some really, really nasty counters and probably lead to the finish.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing with John Silva and all the fighting nerds, right, is the depth of their technique that they have to their arsenals. I mean, and across the board, you see it with Rufy, you see it with Prates, you see it with Silva. What they can hit you with is such a broad spectrum that it's really led to some really exciting fights. You get spin kicks, you get spin elbows, you get all these intercepting shots. Really going to be probably the fight of the night, I think.
Could be.
Yeah.
Just two quick fights that I want to bring up. I don't want to talk about them for too long, but fights that look like they're going to be on the UFC 313 card, which we don't really have many fights announced for it yet. I want to talk really, really quickly about Myron Santos versus Francis Marshall. I think this is a good matchup. Myron Santos, if you guys aren't familiar, won the last Ultimate Fighter at 145 pounds. Personally, in my opinion, when you look back at the Ultimate Fighter winners from the last decade, I think Myron Santos is potentially one of the best Ultimate Fighter winners that we've seen since even like 2016 and 2015. 2016, we had Tatiana Suarez, who we know is about to fight for the title. And then before that, 2015, we had Kamaru Usman won the Ultimate Fighter in 2015. Since then, we haven't seen Ultimate Fighter winners realize a ton of success within the UFC. But I see a ton of potential in Myron Santos. He actually reminds me a lot of Carlos Prates. He has this really, really slick kickboxing. He has the ability to finish fights. I believe he's undefeated. I'm almost positive he's undefeated. I think with a good amount of experience too. I think he's like 15 or 16-0. Very, very good fighter to look at. And for the guy he's fighting, Francis Marshall, New Jersey native, shout out. He's very good as well. I think he's like 3-1 in the UFC so far. But very good fighter, tough guy. He's got good wrestling and good striking as well. I just think that's going to be a good matchup. And then another guy who the three of us always love to watch fight is Joshua Van.
Yes.
He's getting Bruno Silva, who's coming off a loss to Manel Kopp, but another very, very good fighter, and I think that has potential to be a fight of the night type of deal.
Yeah, dude. Josh Van keeping it really busy. He's fighting all the time. You're always seeing him on cards, popping in here and there. Right now, he's coming off a very big win. I know I picked against him on the last time, but it was just because, he was having some unfortunate matchmaking for a little bit and not winning all his fights. But I think, he has some good momentum coming into the new year. And him starting one off early is going to be, it just shows you that he's wanting to stay in there and he's taking his career very seriously.
Yeah, definitely. Love to see an active fighter. And, man, coming off of that win over Cody Durden, who's also a very, very talented fighter, man, that was impressive. And I think Cody Durden actually came out of that fight with a broken orbital. So Joshua Van putting the damage on people. And then the last thing we're going to talk about today, the unfortunate fight card that we have coming up this weekend. It is what it is. I'm kind of happy that we're just getting fights because we haven't had fights in 3 weeks. So I'll kind of take what we can get. But I think the UFC knows that that's kind of the thought process of the fan base right now. I cannot believe we're getting Dern versus Hebus as a main event. But I don't even think that deserves us talking about it. I think we're gonna bring up the fights that we are kind of looking forward to, or we think have the potential to actually be decent fights from this card. I'm gonna go first. I want to talk about Punahele Soriano versus Udoch Medic. And the only reason I'm talking about this fight is because I'm a big fan of Medic. I think he's extremely talented. He hasn't been to the decision yet in the UFC so far. He's lost to Miktabek Orobai, and he has another loss on his record in the UFC that I'm not really remembering right now. But he has 3 wins in the UFC right now, all by KO, TKO. I think this is a great matchup for him. Punahele Soriano is tough and he's got power, but I just don't think he's technically as good of as a lot of people thought he was going to be when he first came into the UFC. Welterweight is a very, very tough division, especially for strikers. You got to be kind of elite as a striker to make it to the top. And I just think it's a good matchup for Medic. I think he's going to win pretty clearly. And I just think he's a great fighter to look out for, and I think he is going to end up having a great career in the UFC, personally. But that's how I see that going.
Nice. My pick for this card is going to be a debut for somebody. It's Christian Rodriguez versus Austin Bashi. The reason I picked this one is mostly for Austin Bashi. This is going to be his UFC debut. He won a contract back on season 8 of the Contender Series, won by submission. Kid's 13-0. He's had 3 wins by knockout, 5 by submission. He's put in a lot of really good performances recently leading up to his fight on the Contender Series. He had a belt, defended it a couple times. Very grapple-heavy style, seems to be utilizing a lot of wrestling to get him to those positions where he can finish the fight. That being said, Christian Rodriguez is no slouch either, right? He's 11-2. A lot of decisions, unfortunately, but he's definitely derailed some of those hype trains where we thought somebody was just going to be an easy matchup, and it didn't end up being that. That being said, Austin Bashi making his debut, being a pretty hot prospect. There's been a lot of comparisons to Raul Rosas just because they're both so young as they're making their debuts. That being said, I think Austin Bashi is definitely somebody to keep an eye out for, and I don't see this one going the distance. I'd like to say that he's going to get either a win by submission or a TKO with some ground and pound for sure.
Yeah, just a little something on this matchup too. I am going to go with Austin Bashi for this matchup.
Nice.
Christian Rodriguez is a good fighter, but I think he gets his best work done down at bantamweight.
Yeah.
It might be hard for him to make that weight, but he seems to do his best work there. I don't know. Coming up to featherweight, we'll see. Maybe he just needs to kind of work his way into that weight class. But I think regardless of what happens here, I think Christian Rodriguez should get a little more discipline and try to get back down to bantamweight. But yeah, I'm going with Bashy as well.
Nice.
The one I'm going to talk about today is going to be Roman Kopylov versus Chris Curtis. I think this is going to be a sick fight. Chris Curtis coming off an injury and a loss to Brandon Allen. And I think that Chris Curtis has fought the better competition, but I feel like Roman Kopylov has some good momentum. He only has the one loss to Fluffy Hernandez. And I feel like if you're beating Roman Kopylov, you're going to have to implement a lot of grappling in there to really tire him out because he's pretty good on the feet. I feel like Chris Curtis coming off a rib injury too is going to have a lot to play with this since Kopylov uses a lot of body kicks in his game. And I think this is probably going to be one of the more exciting fights on the card, but it is probably going to go to decision. So I see Kopylov probably taking it 29-28, 30-27, something like that.
All right. And I think this is Chris Curtis's first fight with his new camp, I believe, as well, since he separated from Sean Strickland and all of that.
Interesting.
I think that happened right after the injury. He was like, you know what, I'm done. I'm going to go find a new gym. And I think he's moved, and I don't think we've seen him fight since he got his new team. So it'd be interesting to see if they've implemented any changes to his game or if they're just going to kind of keep that same formula that, has been what Chris Curtis is.
I feel like stylistically, it's like Chris Curtis's game is anti-wrestling boxer. And I feel like he needs people to play into the anti-wrestling for him to, be able to start letting his hands go. Like the people that Chris Curtis are going to beat are people that are going to gas themselves out trying to shoot takedowns on him that he's going to defend, and then he pieces them up with his boxing. His striking defense is pretty cool. He does like that same little Philly shell that Sean Strickland does a lot. But that leaves him very susceptible to, getting low kicked and having people be able to outmaneuver him on this, like going side to side on the cage and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, and being that Kopylov does have nice kicks, and he mixes it up well, he kicks to the legs, and he comes up high. I could see Chris Curtis having some trouble at kick range with Kopylov. But yeah, those are the fights that we picked from this card, being that it's not really an exciting card overall. Not to say, sometimes these cards where we look at it and it seems shit on paper actually end up being really, really good cards. Like Cesar Almeida versus Abdul Razak Al Hassan will probably be a banger. But I don't know. When you go down to the prelims, it gets pretty rough. But that's our thoughts on the Dern versus Hebus card. Not even going to talk about Dern versus Hebus and waste your guys' time. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one. Please like and subscribe and comment. Please comment. I try to reply to every comment. So if you got thoughts on what we talked about, please let us know down in the comments section, and we'll catch you on the next one. Adios.
Peace.